I'm Sarah, and I need to tell you about the night my family didn't just betray me. They executed a plan so calculated, so meticulously crafted, that it made me question every memory I thought was real. This isn't just about losing a house. This is about discovering that the people who raised you can become expert thieves, armed with years of preparation and a blueprint designed to erase you from your own existence. The devastation didn't start with angry words or slammed doors. It began with a dinner invitation and ended with me holding my house key like a relic from someone else's life. The casserole still radiated warmth as I stepped away from the stove, kitchen towel draped over my shoulder. That towel held the faint scent of last summer's lavender, a detail that somehow felt important, like I was trying to weave memory into reality. 6 a.m. had found me scrubbing surfaces until they gleamed. This wasn't ordinary dinner prep. This was my debut performance as a legitimate homeowner. My opportunity to prove that I could create something worthy of respect. Maybe I was trying too hard. Maybe the obsessive cleaning and careful arrangements screamed desperation rather than confidence. But I needed this evening to unfold perfectly. The dining room table looked like something from a magazine spread. Grandmother's china plates caught the afternoon light filtering through my windows. Those faded blue rims held decades of family memories, the kind of nostalgia that makes you believe in permanence. I'd even crafted name cards, printing them during my lunch break and laminating them with the office machine. Dad's card sat at the head of the table, naturally. Mom's place was to his right. Emma's position faced mine across the polished wood surface. The arrangement felt diplomatic, carefully balanced, like we were negotiating peace treaties instead of sharing a family meal. Walking through my preparations one final time, I allowed myself to imagine their reactions. Maybe Dad would finally look at me without that calculating expression he wore whenever I made independent decisions. Maybe Mom would stop rearranging my belongings as if I'd never learned proper placement. Maybe Emma would offer genuine approval instead of her usual barely concealed judgment. The fantasy felt fragile but necessary. At exactly 6,035, gravel crunched under tires in my driveway. My stomach performed a familiar dance of anxiety and hope. I adjusted the wine bottle's position for the third time today, smoothed my skirt, a garment I rarely wore but hoped would signal sophistication, and prepared to open my door with practiced enthusiasm. The doorbell's chime echoed through my hallway. I opened the door wearing a smile I'd rehearsed, not because it was fake, but because I desperately wanted this evening to succeed. "Smells like food," Emma announced, stepping across my threshold without bothering with greetings. Her suede boots, expensive ones that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, tracked faint dust across the floor. I'd mopped twice this morning. Dad followed her inside, his eyes immediately scanning my ceiling with the intensity of someone conducting a property inspection. "This place has solid bones," he said, his voice carrying that tone I'd learned to recognize. "Feels like it should belong to everyone, doesn't it?" I laughed, though something cold began settling in my chest like frost forming on glass. "It's cozy, I think." Mom entered last, moving with her characteristic silence. Her fingers grazed my mantelpiece where I'd placed a framed photograph of us from my 10th birthday, back when their affection didn't feel conditional, when love didn't come with performance requirements. We settled into our assigned seats around the table I'd arranged with such hope. The salad remained untouched throughout the evening. Emma scrolled through her phone beneath the table, while Dad peppered me with questions about my finances. His inquiries felt less like paternal interest and more like an audit. "You know," he said between measured bites, "a house this size creates significant responsibility for one person." I maintained my careful smile. "I'm managing fine. Nobody asked about my recent promotion, the achievement that had made this house purchase possible. Nobody complimented the meal I'd spent the entire day perfecting." During the main course, I caught Mom checking her watch repeatedly. "Everything's cooked properly," she said eventually. "Thank you," I replied, though she wasn't looking at me when she spoke. Dessert arrived with my growing awareness that something felt fundamentally wrong. I presented the apple cobbler with genuine pride, homemade crust, hand-cut apples, the kind of effort that used to earn praise when I was younger. I waited for Dad's reaction, for any acknowledgement of the care I'd invested in this evening. Instead, he stood up. But this wasn't casual rising from a chair. This was deliberate, choreographed movement. He folded his napkin with businessman precision, placed it beside his plate like he was concluding a transaction. When his eyes locked onto mine, I recognized something that made my blood freeze. I'd seen this expression when I was 15 and mentioned applying to out-of-state colleges. I'd seen it when I bought my car without consulting him first. This was the look that preceded life-altering announcements disguised as reasonable suggestions. "We've been discussing this situation," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "This house should return to family ownership." The words hit me like physical blows. "I'm sorry, what?" Mom nodded, still avoiding eye contact. "You've done well, honey, but this property represents too much responsibility. We believe it's time for you to refocus your priorities." Emma leaned back in her chair, arms crossed like she was watching entertainment. "Nothing personal about it. Your old bedroom remains available," Dad continued with the tone of someone offering generous alternatives. "But we'll be relocating to this property. Kevin has already begun drafting renovation plans." I stood so quickly that my chair scraped against the floor with a sound like screaming. "You're planning to what?" "I prefer we keep this conversation rational," Mom said, as if I'd raised my voice or shown any emotion beyond shock. "It's simply real estate, Sarah." That's when I noticed Emma had disappeared from the dining room. She returned carrying something that made the world tilt sideways: my suitcase, the blue one I'd used during college moves, already packed. "We organized your essentials," she said with practiced casualness, "just to ensure a smooth transition." My voice trapped itself somewhere behind my ribs. Words existed in my mind but couldn't find their way to my mouth. "I'm the legal owner," I finally whispered. Dad's smile was thin as paper, sharp as a blade. "We'll sort out those details." I didn't cry. Tears would have given them satisfaction they didn't deserve. Instead, I walked to the table with steady steps, collected my purse and car keys, and placed my house key gently beside my untouched wine glass. The metal caught the candlelight one final time. Nobody spoke. The silence felt thick enough to suffocate. Outside, the air bit with unexpected coldness. I loaded my suitcase into my trunk, each movement feeling surreal, like I was watching someone else's life collapse through television static. I drove without destination, my suitcase sliding against the trunk walls with every turn. The sound reminded me of a heartbeat, irregular, desperate, trying to remind me what reality used to feel like. Streetlights blurred past, houses glowed with warm light that now seemed like mythology, the fairy tale of belonging somewhere permanently. When I finally stopped, it was at a gas station on the town's edge, the kind of place that still sold car air fresheners and coffee that tastes like regret. I parked under buzzing fluorescent lights, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. It was already ringing. The unknown number flashed on my screen. Something deep in my instincts told me this call wasn't from my past, it was from the part of my future they hadn't managed to steal yet. "This is Sarah." "Ms. Mitchell, this is Rebecca from Valley National Bank's mortgage department," a voice too cheerful for a Sunday evening replied. "I'm calling to verify some unusual changes requested on your account." My stomach clenched like a fist. "What kind of changes?" "There was a request to add co-owners to your mortgage and update the primary contact information. We flagged it because it didn't come through our secure portal and the information seemed inconsistent with our records." I turned toward my windshield, gripping the steering wheel, though my engine was off. "I didn't authorize any changes. I haven't shared account access with anyone." A pause that felt like eternity. "That's exactly what we suspected. You remain listed as the sole legal owner. No co-owners, no power of attorney documentation, nothing shared. We've locked your account for security and logged the attempted modification." I swallowed against the bitter taste in my mouth. "Do you have the names they used?" "David and Linda Mitchell, my parents' names." Of course. The shock wasn't in hearing their names, it was in how completely unsurprised I felt, like some part of me had been waiting for this confirmation. "Thank you for calling," I said, my voice steadying with each word. "Please, send me documentation of everything." "Absolutely. And Ms. Mitchell, I'm genuinely sorry this happened." I ended the call and sat in the artificial daylight of the gas station. The neon buzzed above me like a trapped insect, but something had shifted inside me. Quiet as a pin dropping in a cathedral, but unmistakable. I pulled onto the road and drove through the darkness. By the time I reached my neighborhood's familiar curves, dawn was breaking through clouds, washing everything in soft gold that felt like mockery. I slowed when my driveway came into view. My key didn't fit. I tried again, thinking my hands were shaking too badly to work the lock properly, but there was no give, no recognition. The metal rejected me completely. I stepped back and looked up at my house, except it wasn't mine anymore. Different curtains hung in the windows. A potted plant I'd never purchased sat on the porch like it had always belonged there. The door opened before I could knock. A woman I'd never seen stood there, maybe early 20s, wearing joggers and a hoodie that obviously didn't belong to her. Her expression was prepared, like she'd been briefed on what to expect. "You're Sarah?" she asked. I nodded slowly. "This is my house." She tilted her head with practiced sympathy. "I was told you wouldn't be coming back." "Told by who?" "Linda and David. They explained you'd been having some stability issues, that you'd left voluntarily." My jaw clenched, but I refused to give her the performance she'd probably been instructed to expect. Behind her, I caught glimpses of my hallway transformed into someone else's space. The rug had vanished. Different picture frames lined the walls. My home had been dressed in strangers' clothes. "I'm going to need you to leave now," she added with artificial politeness. I stepped away from the door without arguing. My heels clicked against concrete as I walked to my car, each step a fight against trembling. As I buckled my seatbelt, Mrs. Patterson from next door strolled past with her dog. "Morning, Sarah," she said cheerfully, like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't just witnessed me being locked out of my own existence. I managed a nod and nothing more. Dock driving away, the silence inside my car felt crushing. The air was thick, like I'd stepped out of reality and into a nightmare where I was the only person who remembered the truth. I didn't go to a hotel. I couldn't face explaining my situation to desk clerk. Instead, I drove across town and parked outside Rachel's apartment building. She was my closest friend, honestly, my only friend who didn't come with conditions and expectations. I sat in my car, letting the weight of everything settle into my shoulders like wet concrete. How do you explain that your family changed your locks, installed a stranger, and erased you while smiling over dinner? How do you make that sound like reality instead of paranoid delusion? I was still sitting there when darkness fell. Rachel found me wrapped in the same silence I'd left the house with. She didn't lecture me about calling first. She opened the passenger door, slid in beside me, and simply waited. "I need to collect some things," I said eventually, "from what used to be my house." She nodded once. "Let's go." The drive back felt like traveling through a dream. The stranger was gone now, and the porch light was off. Rachel stood by the walkway while I tried to peer through gaps in the blinds. Inside, the living room was illuminated, and someone was moving furniture. Framed photographs lined the mantel, none of them mine. The space I'd carefully curated had been completely redecorated. A porch light flicked on next door. An older man in a windbreaker stepped out. "You're Sarah, right?" he called. "I am." He looked down the street, then back at me with uncomfortable recognition. "They've been coming and going for weeks, always while you were at work. I figured it wasn't my place to say anything." Rachel turned to me, her voice cold as winter steel. "You need to get a lawyer. Tonight." Rachel poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug I remembered from her first apartment. She didn't offer advice or empty comfort. She just set it in front of me and sat down across her kitchen table. The silence stretched between us, not awkward or heavy, just waiting for me to fill it with truth. I stared at the mug, tracing its hairline crack with my eyes like it could somehow anchor me to something real. "They didn't just push you out," she said finally. "They planned this." I nodded. "The neighbor said they'd been there for weeks." "This isn't miscommunication, Sarah. This was organized." I didn't respond immediately. My chest felt like someone had stacked bricks over it, one cold realization at a time. They hadn't acted on impulse or family drama. This wasn't heat-of-the-moment dysfunction. They had drawn blueprints, and I'd walked straight into their trap, casserole and all. I want a lawyer, I said. My voice didn't waver. Someone who deals with this kind of thing. Someone who's seen families pretend love while plotting theft. Rachel's eyes softened briefly. I know someone. It wasn't until I was alone in Rachel's guest room, lying on top of the covers fully clothed, that the memory returned, clear and unbidden, like someone had switched on a light in a dark room. I was 22, still in college. I'd come home for a weekend to get some paperwork notarized, and I'd pass by the den. The door was cracked just enough to let voices escape. I wasn't eavesdropping, not intentionally, but I heard my name. "She'll sign," my dad had said with quiet confidence. "Once she does, it's ours to manage." Emma's laugh had followed, sharp and knowing. "She's completely clueless!" I'd told myself then that it was about something else. Insurance, maybe? Taxes. I didn't press for details because I didn't want to know. I didn't want to believe they saw me as a tool rather than a daughter. But now, lying in the dim light of Rachel's guest lamp, I realized that moment wasn't the beginning of their plan. It was just the first time I'd accidentally glimpsed the scaffolding. The next morning, we met Barbara Chen at a small office downtown. Her handshake was firm and dry, her voice professional but not unkind. She listened as Rachel explained the situation, glancing at me occasionally as if assessing how far I'd let things deteriorate before fighting back. "You're not the first," she said simply. "People think real estate theft only happens between strangers. It doesn't. The worst cases happen between people with matching last names." I signed the initial paperwork. She outlined our strategy: document everything, avoid emotional engagement, forward all communications, secure all records. The process felt clinical and procedural, but in a strange way, it steadied me. For the first time in days, I felt like I was taking action instead of just surviving. Later that night, Rachel sat beside me as I logged into my cloud storage. Years ago, I'd installed security cameras throughout the house, basic motion-triggered systems that backed up automatically. I barely glanced at the footage since installation, but now, Linda, my mother, sorting through desk drawers in my office. Her face was calm, methodical, like she was organizing her own space. Emma, holding one of my photo frames, removing my picture, slipping in one of herself and Dad. David, sitting at my desk, typing something on my computer, then leaning back to test the chair's comfort. They looked settled, comfortable, like they'd been there many times before, like my absence had simply made their occupation official. "I didn't leave," I said aloud, the realization hitting me like cold water. They were already moving in. Rachel didn't speak. She didn't need to. As I clicked through more footage, another discovery made my hands freeze over the keyboard. My home phone account showed a saved voicemail dated 2 weeks before the dinner. I played it once. "Once she's out." Emma's voice came through sharp and clear. "Don't let her back in, not even for the photo albums." The recording wasn't angry or emotional. She sounded bored, like she was discussing moving unwanted furniture to storage. That night, I didn't sleep. By morning, I wasn't just angry, I was ready. By late afternoon, the tremor in my hands had transformed into something steadier, not calm exactly, but a kind of internal click, like my soul had exhaled and turned toward war. I sat at Rachel's kitchen table, laptop open, scanning through folders I hadn't touched since closing on the house. Documents, PDFs, signatures, all the small victories that made this place legally mine. Even if my family had rewritten the story in their heads, the law remained clear. There it was, a scanned copy of the mortgage release, dated, signed, notarized, full payment made 6 months ago. I'd printed it once and filed the hard copy in my cabinet. But seeing it now on the screen felt like discovering a birth certificate, proof of existence, proof of ownership, proof of rights they couldn't erase. I forwarded the file to Barbara with no subject line, just an attachment. Then I added the closing statement from the mortgage company. Then the title deed, marked sole ownership, my name printed in black ink that suddenly felt sacred. I whispered the words aloud just to hear them. No more trying to be the good daughter. That evening, I plugged in an external hard drive and began methodically reviewing archived footage from my security system. Clips I'd mostly ignored after installation had captured something I never expected to see. Motion-triggered recordings revealed Linda calmly opening drawers in my home office. Not searching frantically or snooping guiltily, just opening, evaluating, closing, like a realtor measuring storage space. Emma placing books on my living room shelves. Not my books, hers. David standing at my desk, unplugging my router and replacing it with one of his own. His name was written across a strip of masking tape in faded black marker. They weren't trespassers. They were settlers, moving into territory they'd already claimed while I was at work, completely unaware. I cataloged each clip, naming them by timestamp, saving them to a folder I titled Evidence of Theft. When I closed the laptop, my palms were damp, not from fear, but from fury so cold it felt surgical. The next morning, over weak coffee, I turned to Rachel and spoke the truth aloud for the first time. "They stole my house!" She didn't flinch, just gave a slow nod. "They underestimated you. That's their mistake." The moment didn't come with fireworks or dramatic music. It was quiet truth finally spoken. In that stillness, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. I wasn't asking for validation anymore. I wasn't waiting to be believed. I picked up my phone, opened the camera, and hit record. Looking directly into the lens, shoulders squared, I spoke with clear precision. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. This is documentation of what was stolen from me by people I share blood with. This is not for sympathy. This is for evidence." I saved the video to the same hard drive, then sealed my laptop shut. Later that afternoon, Barbara sent a draft of the cease and desist letter. 8 pages of legal terminology that sounded like poetry to my ears. I printed it, sat on Rachel's floor with my back against her bookshelf, and read every line aloud. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell and Ms. Emma Mitchell." Every sentence read like a correction to the story they'd tried to publish about me. "You are hereby notified that continued occupation, manipulation, or claim to ownership of the property located at..." When I finished, I folded the letter in thirds and sealed the envelope myself. My hands shook not from fear, but from the power of finally fighting back. That night, I slept without dreaming. But when I woke at dawn, the phone was already ringing. David's name lit up my screen. I let it go to voicemail. When the notification appeared, I listened. "You just started something you won't be able to finish." His voice was low, measured, threatening. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Because finally, I was being heard. The voicemail sat in my inbox like a loaded weapon. I didn't play it immediately. First, I poured coffee I wouldn't drink, stood at Rachel's window, and watched traffic crawl along Riverside Street. When I finally tapped play, David's voice slithered through the speaker. "You just started something you won't be able to finish." No greeting, no explanation. Just a quiet threat disguised as paternal concern. I forwarded the recording to Barbara with a single line. Her response came within minutes. "This is how they escalate. We expected this. Now we apply more pressure." I called the mortgage lender next, wanting confirmation that everything was locked down, that no further changes could be made to the title, but the tone on the other end had changed. "I'm sorry, Ms. Mitchell," the representative said. "Due to the legal involvement, we're unable to provide additional information without formal request from your attorney." The bank had gone quiet. Rachel didn't sugarcoat it. "They're making noise behind the scenes, trying to contain the story. Keep it in the family." I nodded. "Well, it's not in the family anymore." Barbara filed the affidavit with the county clerk by noon. I signed the form with ink that bled just slightly on the page. There it was, Sarah E. Mitchell, sole legal owner. I stared at my signature for a moment after the pen left the paper. It looked like mine. It felt like mine. This wasn't asking permission anymore. It was making a declaration. Around 3, I texted Marcus, "You free for coffee?" "Sure. Usual place?" We hadn't spoken much since our breakup last fall, but he'd always been neutral territory. Steady, even-keeled, not one to pick sides. I thought maybe hearing this story from someone with distance would help me process the madness. He arrived first, already halfway through an Americano when I walked in. "Hey, stranger," he said, standing just enough to be polite. I sat down, wrapping my hands around my ceramic cup even though it burned. "So my family tried to steal my house." He blinked, tilted his head like a confused dog. "Wait, Like actually steal? Yes. Changed the locks, put a stranger inside, told the bank they were co-owners. His expression shifted from surprise to uncomfortable doubt. That's rough, but they're still your parents, right? The word still felt like a knife. Maybe just let them cool off, he continued. Families go through weird phases. They didn't lose their temper, I said quietly. They submitted forged documents. They installed themselves like they were moving into a vacation rental. My mother repacked my dishes. Marcus shrugged. It just sounds like a misunderstanding. I stood up. People who don't believe you when you speak softly don't deserve to hear you roar. His mouth opened, but I was already walking away. Back at Rachel's, I sat on the floor, papers and post-it notes spread out like a crime board. She joined me, still in her court shoes, unbothered by the clutter. Restraining order? She asked. Maybe. At least a lien protection filing. I want layers. I want their legal feet tangled every time they try to move. She nodded. Good. They're counting on you to stay emotional. This isn't personal to them. It's transactional. Her words stuck, not because they were new, but because I finally believed them. I pulled up the voicemail again, the one where Emma had said, "Don't let her back in, not even for the photo albums." She wasn't angry in that recording. She was bored, efficient, and now I understood why. That night, I tried logging into the smart home system for my house. My credentials were denied, password changed, settings wiped. It was no longer Sarah's house in the system. It had been renamed Mitchell Family Home. I drove by just after sunset. The porch light glowed with a different hue, harsh blue-white instead of my soft amber. Through the front window, I could see new portraits lining the walls. Family photos, not mine. Pictures of David and Linda beaming in outdated poses, one of Emma with her dog. A sepia-toned wedding photo of my parents from decades ago. My face was absent, erased. That's when I realized they weren't just evicting me from the house. They were rewriting history entirely. By mid-morning, the cold was already biting. Not sharp like winter's peak, but the kind that lingers around your wrists no matter how deep you bury them in your coat. I parked across the street from what used to be my home. Not a home now, just a structure, a space I'd built with purpose and pride, stripped and hollowed by people who called themselves family. In one hand, I held a manila envelope. Inside was the cease and desist letter Barbara had finalized, along with supporting ownership documents. Everything printed, signed, time-stamped cleaner than anything they'd ever tried to sneak past a notary. I didn't walk up to the door. I handed the papers to the sheriff's deputy, who nodded curtly before heading up the path. I stayed on the sidewalk, the smell of pine mulch from the neighbor's yard mixing with exhaust from passing cars. As the deputy knocked, I looked through the front window. They'd gone further with the erasure. My photos were gone, the one of me with my degree, standing beside the car I'd bought myself. The art I'd hung over the fireplace had been replaced with generic, mass-produced barn scenes. Storage bins that once held my camping gear now bore taped labels in unfamiliar handwriting. Their handwriting. They hadn't just moved me out, they were deleting me. I turned to leave but caught something in the alley behind the fence. A corner of furniture, my bookshelf propped awkwardly next to two garbage bags. I stepped closer, the cold sharper in the shadowed space between garages. The shelf had a long split down the back, like it had been dropped carelessly. One of the bags was loosely tied. When the wind shifted, I caught a scent I hadn't smelled in years: lavender and rosewater. My grandmother's sachets, she used to tuck them between towels, and I'd inherited the last few after her funeral. They'd thrown them away. I snapped a photo on my phone, backed up, and sent it straight to Barbara. Subject line: evidence of destruction. By early afternoon, Rachel and I were back at her apartment, papers spread across the floor like a quilt of consequences. Barbara joined us via speakerphone. I laid out the title deed again, the payoff statement, the clean chain of ownership. This, I said, tapping the closing date, is when it became mine. No co-signers, no shared debt, no transfer agreements. Barbara's voice came through crisp and clear. Good. We'll present this with the footage. I nodded, my voice calm. I don't need to scream. The paperwork speaks louder. That evening, we stood across the street again. This time, the sheriff's office delivered formal orders, legally binding notice to vacate or cease further claims. Two officers knocked. One waited by the gate. David answered, stone-faced. Linda stood behind him, arms folded like she was bracing for a storm. This house was always meant for the family, David told the officers. She's emotionally unstable. Ask anyone. He's never been grounded. They didn't argue with his performance. They just served the law. I stayed hidden behind the passenger seat window, recording the interaction. Not because I needed more proof, but because watching it unfold in real time made something inside me anchor. The more they spoke, the more they exposed themselves. That night, after Rachel and I debriefed, after Barbara logged the day's updates, after I finally sank into the couch and stared at the ceiling in silence, my phone buzzed again. No caller ID. I stared at it until the voicemail icon appeared. I pressed play. You think you've won something. The voice was low, unfamiliar, male, but I knew whose circle it came from. You haven't seen what we're capable of. No name, no specific threat, just venom behind breath. I set the phone down, picked it back up, and forwarded it to Barbara. The next morning, Rachel woke me with a text. Check your credit report, now. The notification came before sunrise, 5 words that made my blood freeze. Still in pajamas, I sat at her kitchen table and opened the browser on her laptop. It took 2 attempts to remember the password. Then the page loaded, and I felt my stomach turn cold. 2 new inquiries. One from a department store I hadn't stepped into in a decade. Another from a credit card company I'd never applied to. Both applications had been submitted from an IP address linked to my parents' home. The name was mine. The address wasn't. I stared at the screen for a full minute before speaking. They're using my identity. This isn't emotional anymore, Rachel said, reading over my shoulder. This is financial fraud. I nodded quietly, seething. It's systematic, and they started laying this trap years ago. Later that morning, I dug through old emails, ones I'd archived but never deleted. There it was, an exchange with Linda dated 2 years back. She'd asked for my social security number for the accountant. Another thread where David requested a copy of my W-2 so he could check something before I filed taxes. I'd sent everything because back then, I still wanted to believe that being cooperative would earn me trust. Rachel and I met Barbara downtown just before noon. Her office felt warmer than usual, less sterile, more focused. The 3 of us sat down, and I slid the laptop across the table. They've crossed into identity theft, I said. What do we do next? Barbara didn't blink. We file immediately. She began drafting an emergency petition for a restraining order, citing not just the house but now the attempted financial manipulation. I handed over every document, every email, every click of stupidity I'd once mistaken for family loyalty. You're not a victim anymore, Rachel said softly. You're a plaintiff. The words didn't comfort me, but they clarified me. That evening, I stepped onto the balcony, phone in hand, waiting for air to move through me. Instead, the screen lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months. Aunt Vera. I hesitated, then answered. Sarah, she said, her voice already tense. Can we just talk like adults? I'm listening. There's a lot of upset happening right now. You involving lawyers, filing police reports. It's not how we solve things as a family. I tried solving things at a dinner table. You remember how that ended, she sighed. Look, I'm not defending what they did, but you need to understand how this looks. You filing lawsuits, making police reports, you're making yourself look ungrateful. My breath caught. Then I exhaled through my teeth. Gratitude doesn't include silence when someone commits fraud. She said my name again, softer this time, like she could undo everything with tone. I'm done, Vera, I said. I'm not your project. I'm not their puppet. I'm the only person in this family who's accomplished everything without stealing it first. Then I hung up. For the first time after a family call, I didn't cry. After dinner, Rachel and I were sorting through folders on her desktop when an email pinged into my inbox. Subject line, evidence play in private. There was no message, just a single audio file. I looked at Rachel, my pulse beginning to climb. Someone send me a recording, she leaned forward. Play it. My finger hovered over the screen, then I hit play. At first, all I heard was the background hum of a car engine. Then David's voice, calm as ever, filtered through the speakers. Restart with the key. Once she's out, change the locks and slowly shift everything over. She'll push back, but it won't hold in court if it looks like a family matter." Emma laughed. "She'll cry first, then she'll call a lawyer." "By then," David replied, "the narrative is ours." I didn't move. Rachel was frozen across the table, eyes wide, mouth slightly parted. The audio continued for another minute. Details about when to switch utilities, who should handle the transition, even how to redistribute my personal possessions. None of it sounded emotional. All of it sounded like strategy. When the recording ended, I saved it in 3 separate locations. We sent it to Barbara immediately. Less than an hour later, we were sitting in a conference room at the courthouse, everything printed, labeled, organized. Barbara handed the judge's clerk a thumb drive and a signed emergency motion. The judge reviewed it within 2 hours. An official hearing was scheduled for the following week. When we walked out of that building, I didn't feel victorious. I felt hollow, but sharper, like glass that had cracked all the way down but hadn't shattered yet. That night, back at Rachel's, I opened my laptop and signed into a private support forum I'd been silently reading for months. A community of women unraveling similar betrayals, financial abuse, emotional coercion, estate manipulation. I posted a redacted version of my story, just facts, no names, no sentiment. By morning, it had over 300 comments. I thought I was crazy. This happened to my sister. My parents did the same thing, only I didn't catch it in time. I didn't respond to all of them. I didn't need to. Just knowing I wasn't the first or the only was enough to pull oxygen back into my chest. Later that afternoon, a reporter from Channel 7 messaged me privately. "Hi, Sarah. I saw your post in the forum. We're doing a series on financial fraud within families. Would you be willing to speak, even off the record?" I didn't reply immediately, but I didn't delete the message either. At some point between lunch and sunset, the ripple reached them. David got a call from an old business partner. Barbara told me he looked blindsided when the man asked, "Is that your daughter in the post about real estate fraud?" He didn't answer, just ended the call. Linda texted me later, one word, "Why?" I stared at the screen, then locked it without typing back. Emma, I learned, had been removed from the speaker list of a women's leadership conference she'd been bragging about for months. The email had circulated. Someone forwarded it to me anonymously. Apparently, being associated with a legal case involving family property theft didn't align with their board's values. That night, I sat on the windowsill of Rachel's apartment and opened the courthouse portal. My case was officially updated. My name, my documents, my scheduled hearing date. I read it 3 times, let it settle in my bones, then closed the laptop. "This is mine," I said aloud, "not the case, the story." The courthouse looked different that morning. Same stone walls, same columns, same sterile benches inside, but I wasn't the same woman walking through its doors. Barbara met me at the front steps with 2 manila folders tucked under her arm, wearing a blazer pressed so sharp it could slice air. Rachel followed behind, clutching a slim notepad even though she wouldn't speak. She was there for presence, for balance, for the memory of every time they'd told me I'd imagined it all. We passed through security and waited outside the courtroom. I pressed my palms together to ground myself. No trembling today. I wasn't afraid. I was ready. "Let them say it," Rachel whispered. "Let them say it with their own mouths." Inside, the room was colder than I remembered. David sat at the defense table wearing a different suit than I expected, less polished, more performative. Linda was beside him, her eyes flicking from the judge to the floor. Emma sat separately, legs crossed, jaw tight. The bailiff called the case. Barbara opened without wasting time, presenting the timeline, the documents, the audio recording of David and Emma coordinating the takeover. Then the judge asked David to speak. He stood like he belonged there, like this was just another boardroom. "We supported our daughter for years," he began. "This is a misunderstanding. We were trying to protect family assets." Barbara interrupted him politely but firmly. "Mr. Mitchell, do you deny submitting false ownership claims to Valley National Bank?" "I deny any criminal intent," he shot back. "If she had just listened, none of this would have happened." His voice cracked slightly on that last part, just enough for the judge to glance over her glasses. Then came Emma's turn. She adjusted her scarf like it mattered, then said, I was only helping my parents organize the property. The place was always meant for the family. Sarah doesn't even like entertaining. It's not like she used that office anyway. Barbara raised a single printout, a photo of Emma removing folders labeled with my name, placing them in a box marked with her initials. The judge leaned forward. You believe the space was yours? Emma's eyes faltered. It felt like shared responsibility. You're not on the deed, are you? Emma didn't answer. Finally, it was my turn. I walked slowly to the stand, took the oath, sat down, and spoke, not as the woman who'd been locked out of her home, but as the one who'd built it. I bought that house alone. I paid every mortgage installment myself. My father and sister entered my home without permission. My mother packed my belongings while I was at work. When I questioned it, they called me unstable. I paused, letting the silence do its work. They didn't just try to take a house. They tried to erase the woman who built it. No dramatics, no tears, just truth. The judge took a beat before speaking. This court finds sufficient evidence that Ms. Mitchell is the sole legal owner of the property. The court also finds grounds to uphold the temporary restraining order and opens inquiry into possible financial misconduct. David inhaled sharply. Linda didn't look at me. Emma clenched her fists under the table. I didn't react. Not in that room. Outside, under bright midday sky, a reporter caught me just before I reached the car. Ms. Mitchell, do you consider this justice? I looked into the lens and answered without hesitation. Justice is knowing I never have to explain myself to them again. But the house wasn't whole yet. It still carried their fingerprints. The key turned with more resistance than I remembered, like the house itself wasn't sure it should let me back in. But when the lock finally clicked, I stepped into silence. It didn't smell like home anymore. The faint trace of eucalyptus I'd loved had been replaced by something synthetic lavender plug-ins, the kind Linda preferred. The curtains were different. Stiffer, dusty blue instead of the cream ones I'd hemmed myself. Even the floor seemed quieter, like it had grown used to different footsteps. I dropped my bag by the door and stood still for a long time. Then, one drawer at a time, I started undoing them. The bookshelf in the living room held magazines I didn't read. A vase I'd never bought sat where my favorite ceramic used to be. I gathered it all, placing each piece in a box I labeled theirs, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Every drawer I opened reminded me they'd been here, that they'd moved through this space with no regard for boundaries. But now they weren't, and I was. In the kitchen, tucked behind the silverware tray, I found it, a cream envelope with my name in Linda's handwriting. Inside was a single page. You'll understand someday. Family decisions are complex. You were always headstrong, but we meant well. This was about preserving what matters. You'll see that one day. No apology, no remorse. I stepped out back, grabbed the metal fire pit cover, and lit the corner of the page with a match. The flame curled through her words like they'd been waiting for it. Ash floated up and away into the late afternoon sky. I watched until nothing remained but the small metal grate, warm with silence. I understand perfectly, I said to no one. That weekend, I knocked on Mrs. Patterson's door, the same neighbor who'd witnessed my lockout. She answered in her usual cardigan and wool slippers, surprised but not unkind. I brought cookies, I said, holding out a foil-covered tray. And maybe just wanted to say thank you. She invited me in without hesitation. Her home smelled like cinnamon and old carpet. We sat at her kitchen table for almost an hour, sipping wheat tea. She told me they'd always suspected something was wrong, that Linda and David had acted entitled, like the property had already been theirs. We didn't want to get in the middle, she said gently. But I'm glad you stood up. I walked back across the lawn with a strange new feeling growing in my chest, something like belonging, not to a family, but to a neighborhood, a place. On Monday morning, Barbara called. The state's financial crimes unit is moving forward. They've seen the forged applications. If it connects directly to your father, there could be formal charges. I nodded, pacing my living room barefoot. I'm not after revenge. I just want it recorded. I want the truth to have a timestamp. That week, I decorated the house for Thanksgiving. I started simple garlands on the banister, a new wreath on the front door, then photos. Not of blood relatives, but of Rachel, of Mrs. Patterson, even a snapshot from that afternoon with Barbara, smiling in the courthouse parking lot. Each frame was a quiet correction. The house began to warm again, not from heat, but from presence. Then, just before dusk on Wednesday, I found something on the porch, a manila envelope, no return address. Inside was a photo of my childhood bedroom as it looked when I was 10, but this time with a red X marked in thick ink across the bed. I stood there for a moment, thumb grazing the corner of the photo. It didn't frighten me. I was exhausted by their games. But this time, I wouldn't be running. The envelope was still sitting on the console table when I woke up. I brought it with me to the police station, filed the photo, explained what it showed and what it meant. The officer nodded, typed, logged it, but without a clear sender or direct threat, there wasn't much they could do. "It could just be symbolic," he said gently. "I know," I replied. "That's why it's worse." Later that week, while I was stringing white lights across the porch railing, Emma showed up. No warning, no text, just her car pulling up, engine still warm when she stepped out. She didn't bring anything. Not a gift, not a peace offering. She just stood there holding her purse like it might contain the version of herself she wanted me to see. "I was nearby," she said. I didn't answer. Thought maybe we could talk. I held her gaze for a moment, then stepped aside just enough to let her pass. She walked in slowly, scanning the walls. Her eyes paused where new photos now hung me and Rachel at the courthouse, a Polaroid of me with Mrs. Patterson from Thanksgiving. She sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded. "It's quiet in here. Most pieces," I replied. She hesitated. "I'm not proud of how things happened. None of us expected it to get legal." "You're not here for me," I said. "You're here to control the story, to soften it before it spreads further." Her mouth twitched. "You think that's all I care about?" "No," I said. "I think you care very much about being perceived as the better daughter." She exhaled. "Maybe I was jealous. Maybe I didn't think you deserved the house." "There it is," I said quietly. She looked away. "That doesn't mean I wanted it to go this far. But it did, and you let it." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I leaned forward. "You don't get to rewrite your role just because I survived it." That night, a Christmas card slid through my mailbox. Cream-colored envelope, no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable, Linda's. Inside was a generic winter scene, and below it, in neat cursive, "Wishing you clarity and peace. Mom." Tucked inside was a printed quote, "Forgiveness is the scent the violet sheds on the heel that crushed it." "No, I'm sorry, no ownership." I didn't respond. Not out of anger or bitterness, but because forgiveness doesn't always require reconnection. A few days later, Rachel and I strolled through the holiday market near downtown. String lights glowed against snow-dusted roofs, and the air smelled of pine and cinnamon and roasted nuts. We paused by a booth selling handmade mugs. "You never spoke publicly," she said gently, lifting one with a crooked handle. "I didn't need to." She nodded. "Sometimes survival is the louder message." I smiled. The silence I'd chosen wasn't weakness, it was clarity. Back home, I installed a new security system, one I chose, configured and tested myself. Then I replaced the old curtains, the ones they'd hung in their attempt to rebrand my life. I added stained glass to the windows they used to look through, and then I rolled up the rug in the living room, the last thing they'd left behind. Underneath, my hardwood floor was scratched, imperfect but strong. Mine. I stood there in the quiet, barefoot on that old floor, and felt something shift. Not closure, not a neat ribbon tied around the mess, but peace. On Christmas morning, the sky outside was soft gray, snow layering the sidewalk like powdered sugar. My phone buzzed. "Rachel, brunch at my place. Chosen family only." I didn't bring a gift. I brought peace, and this time, it was enough. Rachel opened the door with her usual sideways smile and a mock scowl at the snow collecting on her front step. I handed her a small bouquet of winter greenery and pine cones, bundled with a ribbon I'd found in my kitchen drawer. "No gift?" she teased. "I brought peace," I said. "And I don't wrap that anymore." Inside, her place was loud in all the right ways. Laughter from her sister-in-law in the kitchen, jazz playing low in the background, a toddler dragging a stuffed bear across the floor with dramatic flair. The air smelled like cinnamon rolls and brewed coffee, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was preparing myself for something to go wrong. These are people I share blood with, I thought as I sipped cider in the corner, watching Rachel orchestrate brunch like a general with a gentle baton. But they're mine. When I returned home that afternoon, the stillness didn't bother me. I lit a candle near the front window and sat on the floor with a notebook in my lap. Light filtered through the stained glass I'd installed, amber, teal, and a single triangle of red. Every color warmed the hardwood like a quilt. I walked from room to room, not to inspect or clean, just to be in them. The office where I write late into the night was now both workspace and sanctuary. The living room no longer felt like someone else had moved the furniture slightly wrong. The kitchen was mine again, every drawer labeled the way I preferred it, with no one rearranging spices or suggesting I didn't really need a second colander. The house didn't change. I did, and that was enough. 3 days later, I checked my mailbox and found a card from an old college professor, someone I hadn't heard from in years. Inside was a handwritten note and a quote tucked neatly into the corner. "Freedom is not the absence of memories. It's knowing they don't own you anymore." I pinned it to my new corkboard next to affirmations written by women in the support group. Phrases like, "You're allowed to close doors," and "Some survival looks like silence." That same afternoon, I received one last letter from David. His handwriting was as rigid as I remembered. The lines were clean, only a few sentences. "I shouldn't have let things get that far. I was trying to protect what I built. I didn't realize how much of it was yours. No, I'm sorry." No acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just enough words to sound like regret. I read it once, then filed it away in the back of a drawer. Not all doors have to be closed, but some don't need to be reopened. On New Year's Eve, I sat on my porch with a mug of black coffee, bundled in a blanket Rachel had knitted the year she quit her firm. Fireworks cracked softly over the neighborhood, faint behind the trees. "They tried to take my house," I whispered, "and nearly succeeded. But they couldn't take the woman who built it." I watched as the lights faded and the sky settled. Then I stood, walked inside, and locked my door. Not in fear, in peace. This home doesn't need to be explained. It just needs to be mine. And now it is. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that boundaries don't make you selfish. They make you free. Sometimes the people we love most are the very ones who teach us how important it is to say no. I used to believe that family meant forever, no matter what. But now I know forever only works when there's respect on both sides. Taking back my home wasn't just about brick and wood. It was about reclaiming my voice, my value, and the quiet strength I didn't know I had. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to win every argument to reclaim your worth. Sometimes just standing your ground is the loudest truth there is. And maybe you've been through something similar, being dismissed, overwritten, or treated like you didn't belong in your own story. If you have, I hope this reminds you that it's never too late to draw the line and rebuild. What about you? Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If this video touched something in you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if it didn't, tell me why. Your honesty matters here. If you enjoyed this story and want more true, heartfelt journeys like it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for the next chapter. Because sometimes the stories we need most are the ones that remind us we're not alone.